Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are joining us from today. And welcome to the webinar, The Password is Dead. My name is Peter O'Neill, and I am the president of Find Biometrics and Mobile ID World. I am pleased to let you know that you are joining over 373 of your industry colleagues on this webinar event today. I'm also pleased to let you know that we will be sending all the participants on today's webinar an invitation to participate in the largest annual review of the identification industry, the 11th edition of our annual Year in Review. Now more than ever, we need to hear your voice. We have a lot to cover today, so I'm going to jump right in. Here is the agenda. We will have two presentations today, the first from Michael Barrett, president of the FIDO Alliance, and the second from Knock Knock Labs. Unfortunately, our planned speaker, Phil Dunkelberger, has had a personal situation and cannot attend today, but we are very fortunate that Jamie Cowper, Senior Director of Marketing and Business Development, has kindly stepped in all the way from London in the UK. The intention today is to provide a quick overview of the FIDO Alliance with a concentration on presenting what is new and sharing the lessons learned to prepare the marketplace for imminent open FIDO specifications for universal implementation of strong authentication. Michael Barrett, president of the FIDO Alliance, will take a few minutes to briefly explain the Alliance's plans and progress to date. Then Jamie Cowper, Knock Knock Labs Senior Director of Business Development and Marketing, will present the lessons learned in the development of the FIDO protocols over the last year and what those insights mean for both members and the marketplace, vendors, relying parties, and end users. In a very short time, the FIDO Alliance has multiple membership many times over, and arrived at a critical point where FIDO specifications are translating now into products and into applications. At this important juncture, we want to reserve much of the time today for you, our attendees, to ask your questions about the FIDO Alliance and the FIDO specifications so you can grasp what you need to know and what you need to do now. I'm also pleased to let you know that Maxine Mose from Acuity Market Intelligence will be assisting with the question and answer portion today. And to ask a question, simply type it into the dialog box in your go-to control panel on the right side of your screens. Please do this at any time. Don't wait until the end. This will give us an opportunity to manage your questions more effectively. And we'll do our best to answer as many as possible on this very important webinar. This webinar will last about 40 minutes in total, and please note it will be recorded and available at mobileidworld.com. I would also like to take this opportunity to thank our sponsors for their support: Sajam Morpho, NEC, 3M Cogent, Agnitio, and BioKey. And now I'd like to introduce our first speaker, Michael Barrett, president of the FIDO Alliance. Maxine and I had the pleasure of spending a day with Michael at our event, Biometrics Unplugged, Mobility Rules, which was held this past September in Tampa. And we are very fortunate to have him with us today. He is the former PayPal CISO, responsible for security of 130 million global accounts. He's the former VP Security and Utility Strategy at American Express, where he helped define information security program and direct internet technology strategy. And now I'd like to hand the presentation over to Michael.
Thank you, Peter. It's great to be here with everybody. And as Peter said, we're going to try and keep this much more conversational and much less of a presentation. So, Jamie, maybe we can switch to the next slide. So, as Peter said, the FIDO Alliance has grown a lot in what amounts to 9 months. The organization was formally founded last year, but we announced it around about February of this year at the RSA conference, and at that point there were 6 members. This screen is merely showing you some of the members, because we're now pretty much up to 75 or something like that. We're growing very quickly, and with a lot of great members, frankly. So that's one of the really gratifying things is the FIDO Alliance seems to have come along at the right time when everybody acknowledges that we have a distinct issue with passwords and that we really need to come up with credible alternatives. And so on today's discussion, my intention is not to kind of give you the alpha and omega of the FIDO Alliance, because honestly, I could fill the entire session just doing that, but rather assume that you know something about the background of the Alliance, and try and sort of bring you up to current in terms of where we are and how things have been developing, as well as talk a little bit about our plans. So that's how I intend to spend the next few minutes, next sort of 8 or 9 minutes or so. Jamie, maybe you can again go to the next slide. So remember, essentially, the FIDO Alliance is, for those of you in the US, it's a 501c6, which is a non-profit organization which is essentially classified as an industry association. And that really sums up the kind of organization that we are. And essentially, we're trying to do one thing and one thing only, which is develop standards and specifications that allow the industry as a whole to get rid of passwords. And as I said, I can witter on about what's wrong with passwords, and in fact I've happily spent half-hour presentations on that. So I'm assuming, again, and perhaps I'm assuming erroneously, but I think it's a reasonable assumption that you all understand why passwords are slowly dying and why we really have to find credible replacements. But the key thing, and it is worth restating this, is that essentially, as it stands today, the current situation is really, it's hurting end users because they can't cope with the number of user IDs and passwords they have. And so they're compromising their own safety by using false passwords or by using the same passwords everywhere. It's hurting internet service providers. As Peter said, I used to work for PayPal, and certainly, you know, we were very conscious of the issues that we had with trying to secure our customers using passwords, and we use risk-based authentication as a way of kind of essentially coping with the problem that passwords left us with, but not every vendor can afford to do that. And then also for authentication vendors themselves, I am pretty certain that there are some really, really good authentication solutions out there, but the problem is that market is now extremely fragmented, with at least 100 vendors in the space and quite possibly significantly more, and none of them are really able to get traction as a consequence. So I think part of the problem is just because they're all having to compete on the quality of their integration as well as their actual authentication solution, they're struggling to get mind share as a consequence. And so that really is kind of what the FIDO Alliance is trying to do, is basically say, no, look, there should be one standard. Jamie, next slide, please. So essentially, as I mentioned, I wanted to kind of bring folks up to date. And so very much, you know, what we've been focusing on within the Alliance is actually preparing for commercial launch of products in Q1 of next year. And we've always been reasonably consistent in our desire to go from the launch of the organization to the first launch of products in market within about a 1-year time frame. We always believed that was feasible, and we are currently reasonably well on track for that. So we've been going through a process internally where we've been conformance testing products, making sure that they all interoperate with each other, and generally doing the kinds of things that you need to do in order to demonstrate that the products that you've built actually do all work with each other. And so clearly this is not just going to be one vendor launching one product. This is actually going to be multiple vendors releasing multiple products, all within the FIDO family. And I'll say one more thing, which is about certification at least, which is that within the Alliance, there's been a lot of debate recently about that that certification program needs to do more than just say, yes, it's FIDO anointed or FIDO blessed or FIDO sprinkled with holy water or whatever it is, i.e. that, it's got some kind of a FIDO certification mark on it. But that actually we give information to relying parties to allow them to determine, okay, what are the characteristics of this particular authenticator and are they good enough for my particular mission? And we think over time that that may well be one of the most important things that the FIDO Alliance can do, is essentially have not just a certification framework, but really sort of actually help relying parties work out which are the products that are relevant to their needs. So again, Jamie, if you can just pop forward to the next slide. So finally, I think this is actually the last slide I intend to talk to in a minute. Jamie Cowper will take it away. I wanted to just say a couple of things, though, which is the FIDO Alliance has been working on two sets of protocols, which might seem odd in one sense, but actually makes a great deal of sense in another. And so let me talk about them very briefly. So the first of these is something called the Universal Authentication Framework, which sounds very fancy, and essentially it is a framework that is intended to allow relying parties the ability to authenticate an end user without that user having to use a password at all. And so this is kind of the framework that allows us to get to the brave new vision of the future where passwords actually is starting to wither away. As compared with the universal second factor authentication stack, which is essentially a way of hardening up user IDs and passwords in such a way that they can still be used, but that even if the criminal knows the password, he actually can't necessarily do that much damage because he certainly can't authenticate. And so this could be compared to one-time password tokens, except how do you do that in a way that is really easy to use for the end user? And so that's one of the things, and I think it comes out a little in this presentation, that we've really focused on, is how do we do authentication such that it's both stronger for the relying parties, but also much, much easier for end users. And that's something that just underpins everything we've done. And so again, we may talk a little bit more today about UAF versus U2F, but essentially U2F is viewed very much as a kind of bridge protocol to get to this longer utopian vision of how do we actually start blowing up passwords. But anyway, that's probably enough for me. Jamie, why don't you take it away and talk a little bit more about the FIDO Alliance work as well as what Knock Knock Labs has been up to.
Sure. Thank you, Michael. Thanks very much. And I would just jump in and I suppose give you a bit of context as to who we are, Knock Knock Labs versus the FIDO Alliance, or not exactly. And also just before I start, say, thank you, Peter, for the introductions earlier, and I would send my apologies on behalf of Philip Dunkelberger, our CEO, who wanted to be able to present today, but unfortunately has been unable to. So just to provide context for those who have not heard of us, we are Knock Knock Labs is one of the founding members of the FIDO Alliance. We have been working with the other members very closely on bringing FIDO solutions to market, and I'll talk a little bit about the lessons I suppose we've learned over the next 10 minutes from our discussions with the varying parties in the ecosystem. And in order to drive something such as the FIDO Alliance, you do need to have this ecosystem of different different proponents. And particularly, obviously, we have the different security authenticator vendors who are providing innovation at the endpoint, whether that's a biometric solution, whether that's a token-based one, whatever that might be. But equally, relying parties, device manufacturers, component manufacturers who really, bring a lot of the authentication technologies to market. So if I was to say, what Knock Knock Labs has been doing, well, we were launched actually at the same time as the FIDO Alliance back in February of this year. Really very focused on bringing server and client solutions around the emerging FIDO protocol to market. When we look at it, we were, a lot of the protocol stack around the UAF comes from some of the work in Knock Knock Labs, but we're very much working with any members of FIDO Alliance in order to figure out how we can deliver solutions that are appropriate, as Mike was saying, to both consumers and to relying parties that meet security requirements, but also arguably as importantly usability ones. And so a few observations. I mean, and particularly, again, we're very happy to discuss, U2F, but some of this will be perhaps a little more focused on the UAF experience. But certainly, one of the things, is that the new generation of devices are rich in diverse authentication capabilities. So, if we were to take, a smartphone, at random, and, this could be true across, tablets and PCs, though certainly one of the major learnings that we've had in the last 12 months has been the extent to which the market is focused on the smartphone as the source and the place where the transaction wants to occur. I think one of the interesting things is perhaps we assumed that it was possible to use the smartphone more as a second factor for a laptop-driven transaction, e-commerce, banking, whatever it might be. But actually the reality is much more about driving the entire transaction from the mobile experience. So, but if we looked and considered, the different kind of authentication capabilities, there are some perhaps more obvious ones, camera capabilities, microphones on pretty much every single smartphone. Equally now we have, with Apple, as the first mainstream one, to bring a fingerprint sensor onto a smartphone. If you're outside the Japanese market, obviously Fujitsu and other vendors have been bringing fingerprint-based recognition to smartphones in that market for a number of times. But we've also seen since then other devices coming out and rumors of more in 2014 as the fingerprint seems to be a methodology that the vendors are really looking to work with. But there's also some other equally important things that help build up that proof, that identity. And one of the key ones is a secure execution, a secure storage. So these different ways in which, if we, one of the key things that the FIDO enables us to do is to turn, proprietary ways of speaking to authenticators and to back-end servers into a common standardized back-end that requires the creation, storage, and distribution of cryptographic keys. Now, in order to deliver the kind of security assurances the relying parties will require, in some instances, that means you're going to need to be able to create keys and to store keys securely at a device level. Now, what, of course, you have in modern smartphones, as indeed in modern PCs, is secure storage areas. So if we look at the investment that a number of the device OEMs have made in the TPM chipsets, I believe there's been more than 1 billion TPMs that have been deployed across laptops, across the PC OEMs. An obvious place to do cryptographic function and storage. But equally, within the smartphone, there are multiple areas that's potentially the case. And we've seen this, in embedded secure elements, but also with ones that are driven from micro SD cards, and also as well on the SIM cards themselves. So, there's potentially you're bringing the mobile network operator into play in how to access that. And indeed, NFC as a protocol has driven, more secure storage being pushed onto smartphones. So I think, one of the things that we've really seen over the last 12 months is that, the requirements for a modern authentication protocol are already in place on the devices that consumers are carrying, or they're becoming more and more commonplace. And that really is about taking something that's very natural then to the user and enabling that to be extended to remote services. So, what we're talking about delivering is, is a common experience that should be natural to user. A user has become accustomed to storing, to using a fingerprint sensor on an Apple iPhone S to access their device, or potentially buy something on iTunes. It becomes a very natural experience for them to then extend that potentially to other third-party websites. Equally, it could be a simple PIN, based around, a securely stored credential. But the whole idea is that we're not asking users to perform some kind of unnatural action in order to achieve greater authentication. And that would be another, key learning is that, certainly I think as Michael touched upon it, is that the most secure is definitely not always the best. So whilst, a number of relying parties certainly have minimum criteria for certain transaction levels, indeed, this should be the case. And that could be hardware-based, hardware with certain characteristics. I think one of the key reasons that the FIDO Alliance hasn't gone down a route of trying to provide an assurance level for authentication is because that really is very much up to the relying party. And that would very much differ based on who I am as an individual, where I might be, and other information they can draw from this really outside of the core FIDO protocol, but that lives within their risk engines and speaks to the nature of a transaction or the nature of a user. So it was inappropriate, at least at this time, for FIDO to try and say what is a good or a bad authentication, but really important that we're able to say that this is a FIDO, this is a FIDO verified authentication. It meets the criteria and it meets the standard. And I don't want to dwell too long on the architecture itself, but merely talk at a high level that this is very much we see this is a partnership that's being driven by device manufacturers, by component manufacturers, and by relying parties. It needs these different sides of the ecosystem to embrace the technology, whether that is a client, a multi-factor authentication client delivered by Knock or a server, or one from any of the other FIDO members, but enables it to do this, the protocol key functions, enable you to discover what capabilities are present locally on a device, to map that to the policy established by the relying party, and then allow for that continuous authentication using the relevant credential. I don't believe it's come up yet, but I mean certainly I think it's important to note that the principle of the FIDO Alliance is that the secrets, the biometric template, the private keys associated with authentication never leave the device. And that's another area in which the secure hardware, secure storage, secure operating systems add significant value. But again, it's important that a relying party will always understand to what extent a different authentication solution is able to protect the credentials on a device. So that's clear information that will be provided at the server side that allows them to make that policy. In some instances, a purely software-based authenticator will be absolutely fine to meet their business purpose. And will be appropriate because it's a far stronger experience and better experience than a long clear text password, which is the only alternative potentially on a given device. But it's, again, that's a decision really that only the relying party, the person taking the risk associated with authentication can decide. And they'll also be making that based on the extent their risk and identity systems can allow a user to give them that information. So we see, we have these solutions, as I said, now available, in the marketplace. And as Michael touched on, there has been a significant interoperability process that's been going on inside the FIDO Alliance. Now, any member who has access to the JAR specifications obviously has been able to work on technology, about that. And indeed, it's been necessary to in order to get, solutions in the marketplace to see, to discover, the points of improvement potentially. So Knock Labs as a company is producing servers intended for deployment within relying parties or within identity providers to serve those relying parties. And we're also working on client software for mobile and desktop platforms where this very much for us is a partnership with device and component manufacturers to deliver those FIDO-enabled devices into the hands of consumers. And that's really, I think, as much as anything, as well as the FIDO versus specification, it's getting those enabled devices, out into the marketplace in significant volume is a key job for for us all in 2014. And of course, to ensure that there is this broad range of different authenticators, biometric, PIN-based, token-based, that can meet the different needs of our consumers and their different experiences. So with that, Peter, I think I'd like to hand it back to you, and that we can certainly jump into any of them, I'm sure, many questions that the audience have for us.
Well, thank you very much, Jamie. I appreciate the presentation, and again, thank you very much for filling in and taking over the responsibilities today for Knock Knock Labs. Much appreciated. And I'd like to start off the questions now, and I'd like to ask Maxine, can you start us off with a question, please?
Sure. Thanks, Peter, and thanks, gentlemen. That was terrific. It was interesting for me, of course, because I always come from the market development perspective, is to look at actually how rapidly this vision is being transformed into reality. And I guess what comes up for me in terms of, and this is really for both of you, is a little bit of sort of the chicken and the egg in terms of talking about relying parties and device manufacturers and authentication providers. And, how do you envision this actually rolling out into the market? Where do you see the adoption starting and then expanding in terms of, are there specific targets in the market in those different arenas? Where do you see that momentum building from in terms of how this kind of standardization is going to move forward?
Yeah, so this is Michael. So for those of you that hang out with me for any length of time, you'll know that I love to use quotes. And I'm very fond of the old Niels Bohr quote, the father of quantum mechanics, who famously said, "Prediction is hard, especially if it involves the future." And so I'm kind of fond of that because it slightly sums up where we are. I'd also, and you alluded to this a little bit, Maxine, which is that we are, in a sense, trying to bootstrap a network here, and that's always a tricky process, and networks don't self-bootstrap very often, and they only do so when a certain number of things come together simultaneously. But it's pretty clear that the first thing that you need is you have to have need on the part of the users, and it's pretty clear, if you look back a decade ago, the average consumer wasn't that fussed about user IDs and passwords on the internet. And I can remember, talking to consumers back in 2003 and saying, okay, how many internet user IDs and passwords do you have? And the answer was pretty typically, oh, I don't know, 4 or 5. Why'd you ask? And you ask them these days, and they get this glazed look in their face, and in an extreme case, they might raise their hand to your throat as if to strangle you, and they'll say, I've got 35 of the damn things and I can't cope. And so that's kind of the first driver, is you actually have to have users who really want to do something better. And so that characteristic, I think, has really only been in place for a couple of years now. The second thing you need in the context of this is you clearly need relying parties that are motivated to make changes, because either the level of fraud that's driven from passwords is causing them difficulties operationally, or it's causing them difficulties financially. And there was a Forrester report a few months ago that said in 2012 the amount of cybercrime perpetrated across the world was in the range of $100 billion at the low end, up to $250 billion at the high end. And I would submit, with those kinds of numbers, it's pretty clear that, in fact, there is now considerable pressure on relying parties to do something better, simply because the amount of money that they're losing is relatively obscene. And then the third piece of it is, so you essentially need need on both sides. You need the need on the user side, and you need it on the relying party side. And then the third thing you have to have is you have to have a viable alternative that starts emerging with software products, with devices that are FIDO enabled, and a rich set of authenticators that are emerging in the market. And so for various reasons, we believe, in fact, we can engineer the kind of simultaneous product launches that we've been talking about. And, you know, the belief then is that, in fact, you just have to kind of light the fuse on the firework and stand back and watch the pretty show. Maybe in some ways that's simplistic, but I think that's actually the heart of it. The other thing I would touch on is this, which is there is actually a big question in my mind as to, is this going to emerge in the consumer market first, or is this going to emerge in enterprises first? And the reason I say that is because enterprises are a microcosm of kind of the internet at large. You know, large enterprises have got tens of thousands of users showing up with their own devices that may well start to be FIDO enabled. Enterprises do have more control over the device footprint on their network, although the days of enterprise-issued devices is mostly long gone now. But nonetheless, there are folks, you know, like all of my old colleagues at CISOs who kind of exhorting their enterprises, hey, we need stronger authentication in my enterprise. But the demand for an easier-to-use solution is very strong there as well. And so it wouldn't surprise me in the least if we actually start to see traction emerging in the enterprise marketplace first, then followed by consumers. It's, as I said, it's hard to guess, but it's a reasonable prediction, and people tend to forget that piece of it. I don't know, Jamie, what would your perspective be on this one?
Yeah, I think you definitely might. You know, you've covered a lot of it, I would say. But I mean, I think certainly, particularly enterprises at the larger end of the scale, you know, have very much the same problems of, you know, which device am I logging in with today? You know, and users, you know, wanting to be able to use, you know, Android devices, you know, Mac, you know, tablets, PCs, you know, a broad range, which makes it much harder to support a traditional token as the be-all and end-all for a stronger authentication. You know, before you even go into commercial models or any of that thing. And I also think, you know, that because there hasn't been the centralized, you know, plumbing for a lot of these solutions, people have been trying to switch off. You know, I mean, the amount of times you hear, oh yes, we got fingerprint sensors on half our machines, but we switched them off because we couldn't figure out how to use them. Yeah, so not being able to leverage stuff that's already there, that they paid for, you know, is definitely, you know, another key driver. I think, you know, because operationally you could just do stuff smarter if you can just build out, you know, if you can build out like common infrastructure for multiple devices and multiple authentication capabilities. So yeah, absolutely, I think that need is there in the enterprise, and certainly from the discussions we've had, it is there as well. But yes, it's about building that forward.
Okay, we're going to jump into the next question here, and I'm going to just ask that we keep our answers to these questions fairly short. So I'm going to move into the next question. And the next question is, how does FIDO address third-party service providers like banks who perceive risk associated with trusting a token authentication affirmation from an unknown and uncontrolled device?
This is Michael. Let me give a very quick response to that. It's funny because people sometimes think of this as something different in some way from where we are today. If you're aware of a bank that actually issues users with a laptop in order for them to access online services, I'd be slightly amazed. But so essentially, today, every institution that transacts on the internet already bears this risk. This is something that we're actually all used to. That may seem a slightly perverse position, but I actually think it's the correct one. But again, Jamie, what would you add to that?
Yeah, I mean, I would agree. I think, you know, it is. There are some things that are, you know, in scope and something out of scope. What, you know, this will give you is a common level of you know, understanding about what, you know, is the characteristics of the authenticator on the device used. You know, it doesn't, you know, aggregate. Now that could be delivered to a bank by, you know, an identity provider that's running a service for them, or it's something that's run in-house by the bank. And if it's by a third party, then there's got to be a trust model figured out there, and it could be any of the existing federation capabilities could be could be leveraged there.
Great. Here's the next question. If FIDO requires all biometric-related data to remain on the device, how does FIDO propose to secure that data, especially in light of the Apple spoof? And how does FIDO propose to avoid necessitating multiple user enrollments to account for multiple device ownership?
Again, let me take a quick run at that. This is Michael. Definitely, the question is relevant, and I would make a couple of observations though. One is the Chaos Computer Club spoofing that went on actually was essentially a replication of a biometric, it did not, however, involve compromising the biometric profile that was stored on the device. And I think our argument is, look, if you're going to have to get physical access to somebody to steal their biometric, and you're going to have to get physical access to their device, you might as well, frankly, put a gun to their head and say, hey, log on and transfer $1 million into my bank account, or hand over your wallet, or hand over the contents of your safe, or whatever. It's an intrinsically unscalable attack. And if this were if all 300 of us were gathered in a room today, I would ask you at this point, okay, please raise your hands, all of you who have the email from Adobe saying that terribly sorry their database was compromised and your password has been reset on adobe.com. And I guarantee that probably 10% of the people in the room would raise their hand at this point if we were all gathered here today physically. And that's the issue, is the bad guys like scalable attacks. They don't like unscalable attacks. So that's the kind of first piece of it. The second piece is, I think, the really important one, which is, and I alluded to this right at the beginning when I talked about certification, we believe that there is room in the market for some authenticators where the profiles are stored in software versus others where the profile is stored in more secure hardware versus all the way up into trusted execution environment kind of models. And so in a sense, our view is generally that as an alliance, we simply need to be giving relying parties information about how secure some particular authenticator is, and those relying parties can decide, okay, that's good enough for my particular mission. But I do think that, again, I said earlier, I'm fond of kind of making it of using quotes, and the old quote about, the perfect is the enemy of the good, or the enemy of the good enough, is true. I mean, it's very hard for us to imagine it, to wave a magic wand and create a world in which every single threat vector against authentication is 100% removed. What we're trying to do is make it a lot safer than it is today, and we are reliant on other things emerging in the market, like trusted execution environments, which will start to reduce that risk lower yet. But this is a tough question, and definitely there's a lot of different elements to it.
Great, and here's the next question. And Michael, if I could just ask you to speak a little bit louder. We've had some comments about a couple of people having difficulty hearing you. Ultimately, consumers bear the pain of financial losses due to fraud through higher overhead charges, such as insurance and contract fees. Other than simple negligence, where is the economic motivation for relying parties to put in place the infrastructures required for implementing these new authentication measures?
That's an interesting worldview. I'd argue that, in fact, relying parties are motivated to directly by the losses that are caused. But as I said, I mean, you can go look up data on online fraud losses today, and they're eye-poppingly large numbers. I mean, so my old employer didn't used to publish directly our financial losses to fraud, but we did publish our transaction volume over the quarter, and we did publish what our fraud rate was expressed as in basis points, i.e. hundredths of a %. And you multiply those two numbers together and did that for all 4 quarterly reports, and you could deduce what PayPal's fraud was, but that's the stuff that analysts do. And it was hundreds of millions of dollars. And so the answer is hundreds of millions of dollars is not a number that you can just kind of pass on easily. In the end, that actually translates directly into bottom line profits or lower bottom line profits. And so I think that's the key is once, you know, there is an argument that says, oh, this is just the cost of doing business and it's baked into pricing. And it's true up to a certain extent. But as I mentioned, you know, between $100 billion and $250 billion is a bucket load of money by anybody's standards. And it's my belief that, in fact, companies are sufficiently motivated by the idea of, ooh, I can make another $100 billion on my profits, and that will actually cause them to do things.
Yeah, hi. So Jamie here. I would argue a different way as well and say there are some figures out there that suggest that the amount of mobile payments that drop are anywhere up to 75%. And a lot of that is down to the usability of the experience, and quite a bit of that's, you know, the fact that the authentication on a mobile device is tough. Yeah, anything that simplifies, makes them more usable, and a key tenet of, you know, particularly of a lot of the biometrics use cases, is to make things simpler. So if we can just get a higher percentage of fulfilled transactions, or keep people, you know, on a site, or keep working with this thing, because it's, you know, they haven't got to remember the 8th and 24th letter from their magic word, or, you know, their special date, or whatever it might be, then that's got to be a good thing from a usability standpoint.
Great. Here's the next question. How easy or difficult will it be for a vendor to gain certification with FIDO?
So this is Michael again. I mean, the intention is that the certification program is designed to be as easy as we can make it. And industry conformance testing programs are fairly standardized in the sense of, you know, there's usually, we don't have it yet, but we're in the process of kind of speccing it out. You know, there are usually self-testing frameworks you can use, and then there are industry testing organizations who will kind of outsource this stuff, and you can go to them and have your product tested. And so those things are fairly standardized in the approaches that they take, and they're not rocket science, and we're not trying to do anything different in this regard. We're very much just trying to replicate kind of industry standard approaches on this sort of stuff.
Next question. Much of the positive press around FIDO has to do with how authentication standards can make m-commerce and financial transactions easier and more secure. How can FIDO help in other fields that are adopting strong authentication methods like healthcare, etc.?
I think it's our general view that the need for better authentication, defined as both stronger for relying parties and also easier for end users, is kind of a pan-industry vertical thing. And so I think our view is very much, yes, there may be an initial sweet spot around either internet e-commerce or m-commerce on mobile platforms, but that's far from the only place, and that as all industry verticals are being pushed to adopt stronger authentication because of the kind of rise of the wily hacker, that we all need these kind of solutions. So FIDO is completely agnostic to, am I protecting an online transaction, or, you know, am I just making this particular authentication event both stronger and easier to use?
Yeah, and if I was to look at the people who, yeah, there's a lot of interest, I would say, particularly in government circles, you know, particularly for when citizens are looking to authenticate with government services. When we look at initiatives such as the NSTIC program, you know, in America, there's, you know, a similar initiative in the United Kingdom called Identity Assurance, but these are all about, you know, getting commercial identity providers in there and looking to safeguard, you know, the citizens' relationship with government, you know, whether that's transaction-based or otherwise.
Thank you very much. And for the final question, I'd like to pass over to Maxine for our final question, please.
Thanks, Peter. So I just have a question based on some of what I'm hearing from both of you gentlemen, which is, how easy is it going to be for enterprises, whether they be commercial or government, to integrate existing biometric authentication devices that they have already deployed into FIDO standard systems or networks?
Probably I should give a quick answer and then turn it over to Jamie. So at least the theory is FIDO authentication is designed to be easy for relying parties to plug into. Now it gets slightly tricky if one's talking in the context of an existing authentication model that's already been deployed, because then the question is, okay, how do you bootstrap your existing users into a FIDO model? But at least the actual FIDO integration is, we've explicitly designed it to be as easy as possible on the relying party side. But Jamie, you probably know more about this stuff than I do. So.
Yeah, I mean, I think the answer is going to be it depends somewhat on the devices and are they doing a FIDO verified version of those particular ones. But certainly, the intention is never that a FIDO server is commercially available. Let's throw away all existing investments. I mean, clearly, it's going to be something that perhaps you'd be introducing online. You'd be meeting in a risk engine or a broader identity platform, and some authentication is handled by existing solution, but there's other devices that you want to bring in that support FIDO. So there's different models we're working through with different relying parties that typically, see both, the FIDO authentication and a traditional different kind living online, at least for a period of time, in line, so that they're both working. Because they're both achieving the same goal. If you've already made an investment and it's working and solving a particular problem with a particular device, then that's fantastic. But what FIDO enables you to now think about is all the other devices as well.
Well, thank you very much, Michael, Jamie, and Maxine, for your participation today. We've had more questions on this webinar than any of our past webinars, and I think that means that we're going to have an update from all of you in about 6 months' time or so to see what's happening then. I'd like also to thank our sponsors again, Sajam Morpho, NEC, 3M Cogent, Agnitio, and BioKey for their continued support. A reminder, this webinar has been recorded and will be available at Mobile ID World. This concludes our webinar today, and thank you very much for attending.